away for us?
My bad.
It's all good.
Steal her.
Yeah. Okay, awesome.
mute that for
Yeah, you
now.
can just set your laptop on here. mess with it.
Just make sure it's.
Oh, did I mess with that?
See what happened.
Oh, my bad. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to You in Action, Political Advocacy 101. We're excited to have you here today. This is the first event in a three-part series we'll be hosting throughout the school year, designed to help students engage more deeply with civic life and advocacy. My name is Rory Stewart. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the Associate Students of the University of Utah, also known as ASU. And then this is my Associate Director, Trevin Stevenson. ASU is your student government. We represent your voices across campus and advocate for your needs at the university, local, state, and national levels. Within ASU, the government relations team focuses specifically on civic engagement, legislative advocacy, and ensuring student voices are heard in the policymaking process. We'd like to thank the Hinckley Institute of Politics for their partnership in making today's event possible. Their ongoing support plays a vital role in fostering informed and active citizenship at the U. Now we're thrilled to welcome today's speaker, Professor Matthew Burbank. Matthew Burbank is a professor in the Department of Political Science, where he has taught courses on American government, political parties, voting, elections, public opinion, and political analysis. Professor Burbank has also taught graduate courses on American political behavior, quantitative analysis, and research design. Professor Burbank's research focuses on how citizens understand and participate in politics, as well as urban politics and public policy. Professor Burbank has co-authored 3 books contesting the Olympics in American cities, parties, interest groups, and political campaigns, and Olympic Dreams, the impact of mega events on local politics, as well as a number of journal articles and book chapters. His research has been published in journals such as Journal of Urban Affairs, Political Behavior, Political Geography, Review of Policy Research, Social Science and Medicine, Social Science Quarterly, Urban Affairs Review, and Urban Geography. We're incredibly fortunate to have him here with us today to share his expertise on political advocacy and how students can make an impact. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome to our campus.
Thank you. And let me also just start with a couple of thank yous. Thanks to ASUU for organizing this. I think this is a wonderful event for the student government to undertake, and particularly to Rory and Trevin for doing all the work getting this organized, which is never easy. Also thanks to the Hinckley Institute of Politics for hosting us and for being a very good partner for students, for student government, for the Department of Political Science, for the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences over the years. So Hinckley Institute is a really important institution, and so it's always nice to be able to work with them. And as Rory noted, right, this is the first of 3, so take a look for other events coming up in the future that ASU will be sponsoring on these topics as the legislative session moves along. There we go. So what I want to do is just to note what I'm going to talk about a little bit, some of the basics of how and why to get involved and how to find out more. And again, these are generally quite basic, and so if you have questions, we'll have plenty of time for questions as well. Some of the basics for advocating in Utah and the Utah legislature, and some basics on how to advocate for your cause effectively. And then again, as I said, we'll have time for questions as we move along as well. So please think of good questions and ask those. And if you have ideas about things that you have done that you want to share with others, or things that have worked for you or not worked for you, please share those. Those would be very helpful to your colleagues here. So why advocacy, right? This is called political advocacy. Why advocacy? It's a good question, right? So advocacy is really just expressing your view in support or opposition to something, right? And what I want to note here is what you choose to advocate for or against is really up to you, right? What we want to talk about a little bit is being a bit more effective in the advocacy process. One of the things I want to note here is when I say being more effective in the advocacy process, what I don't mean by that is being successful in the advocacy process, because the reality is for lots of issues, right, there are going to be lots of different contending views out there, and people will at times outnumber you greatly. That doesn't mean you can't articulate your point of view. Also, in some cases, you may be in the vast majority, and so you're sort of pushing downhill. There really is not a whole lot to do, and so be aware that when you're engaged in the advocacy process, right, ordinarily what is important in this is being able to express and articulate your views, right? Making yourself heard, making your point of view known. It matters less, in all honesty, whether you win or lose. And that seems a little counterintuitive in the world of politics, because generally in politics, right, what we think about is, you know, who won, who lost, how many votes did this get, how many, you know, how badly was something defeated, or how highly did it win. But one of the things you want to recognize about that is, again, that within those processes, particularly in competitive elections or on any particular issue or bill, right, there are way more than two sides. There are often multiple sides, and advocating and articulating those multiple points of view is really an important part of the process. So what I would like to emphasize here, right, is just that, again, what you want to try to do is think of what your own view is, express it as clearly and as strongly as you can, but not be sort of overly worried if your side doesn't win, right? The reality is I've been engaged in political advocacy as a citizen for a long time, and what I have to tell you is I almost never win. Right? Usually what I'm doing is I'm usually talking about something that a small group of people care about, and I still think it's important to articulate those views and make sure that my representatives hear about that, but I don't always expect to win. Right? Sometimes I do, most of the times I don't, and that's simply kind of the track record of politics. Right? That's simply the way it goes. Right? Worth noting that when we're talking about political advocacy here, really, again, all we're talking about is speaking on issues that affect how decisions are made about public resources, what decisions are made, and how those actions may affect people like you. Right? So politics here in the very broadest sense. Right? This is not just about again, who wins or loses an election. That's part of it. That certainly is important because, again, elections are all about who's going to get to make decisions. But the point that we want to note here is that the nature of participation and the nature of advocacy don't necessarily mean that you have to be involved in campaigns and elections. It's great if you are, but again, you don't have to do that part of it to be an effective advocate. Right? So just to note, right, there are some obvious things in the world of politics, right? Talking about taxes, that's clearly political, right? Talking about traffic laws, Doesn't seem political, but it's highly political, right? How fast or slow can you go? All those kinds of things, right? Funding for higher education, clearly political, right? Something ASU is concerned with, something all of you are concerned with, something I'm concerned with, something the state legislature is concerned with, right? Those are clearly political issues. But we don't have to think really hard to also note there are lots of issues that are also very much political, but that don't seem so political, right? Very obvious examples, the level of the Great Salt Lake. Doesn't seem like that should be a political issue at all, right? It seems like that would entirely be a matter of science, right? And yet, right, the reality is that the Great Salt Lake has become a big political issue. Whether we spend resources, how we spend resources, in what way we spend resources on saving the lake or not saving the lake, how much we let companies use the lake, all those are issues about public resources. And of course, the Great Salt Lake is a giant public resource, right? It's valuable to companies, it's valuable to wildlife, it's valuable to everybody who lives along the Wasatch Front. It's valuable to everybody who comes here to ski because, of course, one of the reasons we have the kind of snow that we do is because of the Great Salt Lake. Right? If the Great Salt Lake is not there, things change dramatically. And that's a big, important political issue, even though it doesn't seem like it ought to be. Another example, right, that has become a big topic in Utah in recent years, right, access to hiking trails, access to biking trails, where you can hike, where you can bike, where motorized vehicles can go, where they can't go, right? Those are things which don't seem immediately like they're political, but of course they are very much political, right? So those are decisions about who gets to use those resources, how they get to use those resources, and who's going to, in some cases, get preferential treatment in that case, right? Another, you heard Rory talk about me a little bit, right? The Olympics, one of the things I've spent a lot of time talking about. Again, doesn't seem like a political issue at all. In fact, it's all about using public resources to host an event, and an event which is a big multi-sport event, right? Cities tend to use it not because it's a big multi-sport event, but because it tends to bring lots of attention and lots of resources. Salt Lake, as you know, has hosted the Olympics in 2002. It's getting ready to host the Olympics again. And those questions about where events are going to be, about who's going to be able to attend, who's not going to be able to attend, what the costs will be, who's paying for it, what roads will get closed or opened or rebuilt in that process, right? Those all affect public resources. They all affect the way that we get around the kinds of things we can do and can't do. And so again, something like the Olympics, which just seems like a sporting event that you've seen on television, right, in fact, has big public policy implications. And another, for those of you who keep track of such things, right, is whether or not Salt Lake is going to have a Major League Baseball team. That's another one of these issues that, again, doesn't seem like it's at all a political issue. Right? This seems pretty much like Major League Baseball teams are all owned by private owners. Major League Baseball teams are all situated in cities. There's not one situated here, and yet, right, Salt Lake has made very clear that it would like to be a Major League Baseball city, and it's done so because it thinks it will help the city in certain ways, but also, right, we have to think about how are we going to get a Major League Baseball team? Who's going to pay to build the stadium? Who's going to pay for new transportation to get people to and from that stadium? Where is that stadium going to be located at? Who's going to lose property in that process? Who's going to pay increased taxes because there is a Major League Baseball stadium there, right? Those are all questions that, again, are very much political questions, even though they may seem like, well, that's really just about a baseball team. So that's just by way of saying all kinds of things are political. There are all kinds of things that people may want to advocate for or against, right? And so the point of what we're talking about here today is just to think a little bit about the nature of that process. So one fair question is, right, advocacy, should I even bother, right? And I said, it's a fair question. And the reason it's a fair question is because it does take some time and attention and some effort on your part to actually do this kind of thing. It's relatively easy to have opinions about things. It's relatively easy to express those opinions to your friends, your family, your roommates, whatever, right? But if you really want to advocate and articulate for those, right, it's going to take a little more work than that. The good thing is, it's not going to take a huge amount of work, right? But it will take a little bit of work. And so one of the things that's worth noting is that in the United States, right, and I apologize for those of you in my voting and elections class because you've just heard this discussion, right, that the likelihood of participating politically really depends heavily on a person's socioeconomic status. So what does that mean? What that means is that people who have economic resources, in shorthand terms, right, rich people participate way more politically than poor people do, people who do not have economic status. Right? So the question is, why is that the case? It's not the case everywhere in the world, but it is definitely the case in the United States. So why is that the case in the United States? Well, the major reason is because political participation is largely left up to individual citizens. Right? So it's people like you who can choose to decide or not, right? Can choose to get involved or not get involved. And so what we are talking about then when we're talking about the nature of political participation is that we are allowing individuals to make those choices. And again, what we often see, right, if we look at data on this sort of thing, is that people who have resources, right, often are the ones that are more involved politically. And that actually is a bit of a problem in the United States, right? So that people who have resources generally are well represented in the advocacy process. People who have fewer resources, right, are less well represented. And that's one of the things that can be a bit of a problem in terms of something like, going back to an example we were just giving, right, Major League Baseball. So just as an example of that, right, so Major League Baseball owners who are generally wealthy individuals, often multiple wealthy individuals, don't have any difficulty contacting governments, working with cities, working with states, working with organizations like Major League Baseball, right? But the people who may be adversely affected by this, the people whose taxes may go up, the people whose roads may be closed, the people who used to be able to have an open field and now they're going to have a private baseball stadium, right? Those are the people who, again, often are not involved in the political advocacy process. And so the point of all this is, right, just to make the point that in the United States, right, it's largely up to individuals to make this choice. And so what we see is that people who have more resources tend to make the choice to get involved politically. And one of the things you want to be aware of is there's nothing that's kind of a legal requirement about that, right? Nothing that says you have to have this much money to be able to do this, right? What that really is it's reflecting the kinds of views and information that people have available to them. So, why should you advocate? Well, one of the things I would note is that you can do so because you want to make the world a better place. You want to make the world a better place in a general sense, or again, just even your part of the world, right? Here in Salt Lake, or in Sugar House, or on the University of Utah campus, right? That's actually a really good thing to do, right? And it's a good thing to do in part because, right, participation and political advocacy, in fact, are a habit, right? And so if you begin to do this, ideally when you're young, right, then more likely you're going to continue to do it over the course of your life. And that's something which, again, is one of the things that is true. I said, advocacy, you're not always successful, but when you become more successful is often when you get more experience doing this, right? When you've learned how to do it, when you've learned what works and what doesn't work. And so the important point there is not to try to become successful immediately or to try to do everything, but to begin someplace to get involved. Because getting involved, articulating your views, becoming a part of some organization or creating your own organization in a way which will be helpful, right? Those are the kinds of things which are good habits to form and good things to engage in. Okay. Another point to recognize that is if you want to talk about the nature of advocacy, and you want to talk about advocating for yourself or people like you, right? Who better than you to do that? So a couple of points to recognize about that, right, is nobody knows what you want or what you need or what you should have better than you do. So that's one reason to advocate. But also recognize, right, that there are other people like you who perhaps don't have as many resources, who perhaps are a little less inclined to want to get involved, and that's perfectly fine. Again, one of the things about the nature of American politics is people can opt into politics or not, and that's all perfectly fine. Right? It's okay not to be involved. But ideally, what you would like at least is for somebody like you to be advocating for things that would be relevant to you. So again, my final point here is just that, right, who better than you to do that if you're going to advocate? So why is political advocacy difficult? Well, one of the reasons political advocacy can be difficult is because the reality is U.S. government is complicated. Right? U.S., of course, has a federal system, what that means is there are, I actually didn't finish that point, but, but what it means is there are lots of governments, lots and lots of governments. So not only is there a federal government, not only are there multiple branches of the federal government, not only are there multiple agencies in the federal government, but the federal government isn't even most of the government in the United States. Right? Not only are there 50 states, there are 3,000 counties, there are hundreds and hundreds of cities and municipalities and thousands of special districts. Right? So the point of all that is there are lots and lots of government in a federal system. So we divide government up in a way that nobody has too much power. But what that also means is we have lots of governments. And on the one hand, that's a bit intimidating. On the other, what you should recognize is lots of governments is actually a very good thing, because it also means that there are lots of governments that are relatively close to you. Right? So for example, right, as a student at the University of Utah, you're represented by ASUU. Right? As a resident, if you are, of Salt Lake City, right, you are represented by the city council. If you are also a resident of Salt Lake County, right, you're represented by the Salt Lake Council, Salt Lake County Council. As a resident of Utah or one of those areas, right, you're also going to be represented by the state legislature. You're going to have a member of the House and a member of the Senate, right? All of those people are reasonably easy to get in touch with, and it might be nice in some way if we only had to focus on the federal government, and yet federal government is by far and away the most remote from us. Right? So that if you want to be involved in having impact on government, it's a whole lot easier to go to a city council meeting or a county council meeting, or a community council meeting, or a library district meeting, or a school district meeting, right? And those are all different levels of government. So, lots of government can be complex, can be intimidating, but also worth noting, right, that this actually is very beneficial. It's very beneficial to getting people involved in the nature of government. We're all well aware the President, Senate, House, Supreme Court at the federal level, right? But again, most public policy decisions are made by state governments, local governments, cities, counties, towns, and special districts, right? School districts, housing districts, water districts, right? And so, again, one of the things we want to recognize is that there are lots and lots of opportunities and places to get involved. So one question that you might ask yourself is, right, what government is taking action or should be taking action, and who are the decision makers? And that's a key part of advocacy in the sense of, again, there's no point, for example, in writing a letter to your member of Congress complaining about your property taxes. If you happen to own property and you happen to be charged property taxes, right? Members of Congress don't have anything to do with your property tax rates. But, right, members of the school board do, right? Members of the county council do, right? And so one of the things you want to recognize is who's doing what in the nature of government. And so you need to be aware that that's indeed where you're going to be able to have some impact, is by identifying who is it that is going to be taking action, or what action are they taking, or again, should be taking. So, lots of governments, lots of government agencies. How do I find out about this? Well, again, this is one case where life actually has gotten easier here because of the availability of information on the internet. And the internet, in this case, is your friend. Right? So nearly all governments have official websites or official social media accounts. And one of the things that they do is they list what they do, and they provide contact information that you can easily access. Particularly agencies that have representatives, like we'll talk about in just a moment. Utah State Legislature, right? One of the things that is true about that is that that makes it very easy for you to figure out who your representative is, and that makes that process of contacting who you should be contacting for a particular issue a whole lot easier. Also note that media sites are typically very helpful, and that government actions, right, are generally quite well covered by the media. Although, again, one of the problems with media sources in this sense is that media sources tend to focus on federal government, state government, and yet again, lots of things like school board decisions, library decisions, right, don't get as much attention. And this has actually gotten a little bit worse in recent years because we have been, in fact, losing a lot of our local media. So if any of you are interested in joining the media, right, it's a good thing to do. Good thing to get information out. And so I would encourage you, again, to look for media sources that are helpful. Again, as we all know, right, some social media sources are not so helpful, but there are lots of good social media sources. There are lots of good other media sources, and that's a good way to figure out kind of who's doing what in the world of government and on particular sets of issues. Shifting gears a little bit to talk from generally about advocating to advocating Utah specifically, right? What I'd like to note here is that Utah, like every place else, right, has lots of governments. And one of the main kind of sources of power and policy in the United States is, or excuse me, in Utah is the Utah state legislature. Right? So the Utah state legislature, as you know, consists of two different branches, the Utah Senate and the Utah House. The Utah Senate has 29 members. They are led by a Senate president who is elected by the majority party. And then the Utah House has 75 members, right, which is led by the Speaker of the House, who is elected by the majority party. Right? And each party within the state legislature, right, selects its own leaders. In Utah, right, the legislature tends to be dominated by the Republican Party, which means that Republicans generally are the ones picking the leaders who are going to be the Speaker and the Senate President, and also the leaders of the largest caucus. But again, recognize that Democrats as well, and now we also have a third-party candidate in the Utah Senate as well. They have their own leadership structures. So just be aware of that. A very quick overview of the legislative process. Right? I want to talk about this again only because in a place like Utah, right, state legislature tends to be kind of the biggest show. And so, for example, if we look at the number of bills that the Utah state legislature considers during a year, it's a very large number of bills. And that tends to have an impact on other levels of government, but also directly on you because it funds, for example, higher education. It is involved in, again, things like traffic laws. It's involved in where resources go. It's also involved in questions like the level of the Great Salt Lake, as we talked about earlier. Right? So the state legislature tends to be an important entity within the state of Utah. Just quickly, right, in terms of how a bill becomes a law, well worth noting, right, many bills, in fact, do not become law, and that's not altogether a bad thing. So in order for a bill to become a law, it has to begin with a request from the legislator. And as we said, there are 75 members of the House, 29 members of the Senate. Any one of them can request a bill to be opened. The bill itself is actually drafted by an attorney, and that attorney works for the Legislative Research and General Counsel Office. And once they have done a draft of that bill, and once the legislator is satisfied with that bill is expressing the views that they want, right, the bill then gets completed as a draft, it's numbered, and it's made public. One of the good things about the state of Utah is it has a very good website for the Utah legislature. Right? It does a really nice job of providing that information to the public and providing information about where that bill is in the process. If you're interested in particular legislation, tracking it through the Utah State Legislature website is a really effective way of doing that. Some organizations within the state will also provide you kind of information about what's going on. But again, even if you're not a member of any of those organizations, right, you can use the state legislature's website. They do a really nice job of making that information available. And so you can track bills quite easily. Worth noting that once we get to the legislature, right, the bill is sent to a rules committee, both the House and the Senate, and assigned to a standing committee. Standing committee is the one that's going to consider the substance of the bill, may change the bill, may amend the bill, and then it's going to vote on the bill. And as well, then if it passes that committee, right, it goes to the floor of the House or the Senate. And then we should note that if it passes both the House, then it goes to the Senate. If it passes the Senate, then it goes to the House, so it goes through the process again. And if it goes through all those processes, passes both the House and the Senate before the end of the legislative session, and we should note, right, that the legislative session is only 45 days long, So it's a very short session. The other thing to note about the Utah legislature, right, is that it is a citizen legislature. That is, that members of the Utah legislature are not professional legislators. They are, in fact, people who are generally off doing other things most of the time. But during the legislative session, their job is primarily to be a legislator. Again, if the bill passes both the House and the Senate, then it goes to the governor. And the point of going through that process relatively quickly, but is to note that there are lots of places to advocate for or against any piece of legislation in that process. Right? So recognizing that if you are dead set against some piece of legislation that the Utah legislature is considering, and you hear in the media, oh, this has passed the House of Representatives, or it passed a committee in the House of Representatives, right? One of the things you want to recognize is it's not the end of the story at all, right? Because a committee has passed it, or even it's passed the floor, right? There's another body, there's also the governor, right? So there are other places for you to be able to participate in and communicate about that legislation if you're so inclined. All right. Just want to wrap up here. So how can you advocate effectively? Again, one thing is just to know the basics, right? Make sure that you know what's being considered, why and by whom. As we said, there are lots of governments, and what you want to make sure is that you know which of those government agencies is doing what and why. Again, this is why it takes a little bit of time and effort to be an advocate, right? Also worth noting that advocacy works best with representatives. What I mean by that is that the job of a representative is in fact to represent you. And so one of the things that they are inclined and willing and able to do, right, is to listen to your input and to try to formulate into something that they can work with. So that it's useful to be aware that that's the process. Right? Again, members of the House, State, House and Senate, right, the governor, city council, county council, right? These are all representative bodies. They're all people there that if you live in their area, right, they represent you. And then just want to note that whether you're doing that in person or whether you're doing it in writing, right, you always want to express your views as professionally and politely as you can. There's lots of things in the world of politics, and particularly when you're advocating for a position, that you may well want to start by saying, what the hell were you thinking when you did this, right? Or, this is the dumbest idea I ever heard. You may well have that view. I've had that view myself lots of times. However, if you're going to express this to a representative, generally not best to lead with that. Right? So what you want to make sure that you're doing is that you're clearly articulating what it is that you would like your representative to do. Would you like them to vote for this legislation? Would you like them to vote against that legislation? Would you like them to reconsider a vote that they have made? Right? Any of those things is perfectly fine to communicate, but what you want to do is be clear that you're saying, here's what I would like you to do on my behalf as my representative. That just disappeared. I still have it, but... So again, just making the point that want to make sure that we are advocating professionally and politely. Right? Again, representatives are going to hear from lots of people, and the people who are clear and articulate and have something they want to say will work well. Again, if you just simply want to rage, stick with social media, right? Don't communicate that to your legislator. It's not going to be very effective. Thank you. Last point you want to note here is just that one other really good way about engaging in advocacy is to join with other people, right? ASU use an example, but also be aware that there are lots and lots of other organizations out there that can be helpful to you. And the reality is that political advocacy really is kind of a team sport. And so if you want to be able to express your views, you can absolutely do that individually. That's perfectly fine. There's no harm in doing so. But also, if you want to think about how am I going to be more effective, often having support of others, in particular the support of organizations, is a way to make yourself more effective in that process. And so with that, let me say thank you for your attention. And if there are questions, Rory has the microphone.
Yeah, anyone that has questions, raise your hand, and I'll pass the mic over.
All right, I had two questions. First, how do we best advocate for, so I guess as politics are primarily engaged in by people with like higher SES and thus representation is as such, how do we best advocate for positions that may run counter to the interests of those in power?
What I would say to that is, again, recognizing one of the points I made about the nature of advocacy, my own advocacy and that of many other people, right, is you're not always going to win, right? So one thing that is true about engaging in that process is it's still valuable, even if you are not in the majority. Right, to make the point that here are some things about what's being done or how it's being done or why it's being done that you want to be aware of. And advocating that, even if it's not ultimately going to be the winning position, right, is often very useful. One of the good things about the nature of American politics is that it does tend to be relatively free. It's relatively open to lots of points of view. When we make a point like saying that people with more resources tend to participate more in the world of politics, that isn't to say that people who have fewer resources can't do that, right? Because in fact they can. Or that everybody who has resources is necessarily going to. And so one thing that you want to make sure is that even if you're not going to be on the winning side, or you're articulating a view that perhaps is not what you think the state legislature or the city council or whatever is going to do, that's okay, right? It's well worth making that point, if for no other reason than they may change slightly what happens or how it happens or whether it happens, right? So those are all things I think that are worth articulating, even again, if you're not necessarily going to be able to carry the day.
Then my second question is, in your view, do you feel that increasing state power increases individual sort of voice and influence on power, or more centralizes power within the state and the state in the U.S. sense, of course, and removes like state government from the individual more?
So a couple of points I would make about that. Again, generally, one of the reasons why the United States has been successful in terms of being a long-standing democracy is in part because we distribute power very widely. Right? As I said, we tend to think about American politics largely in terms of what the president does or what members of Congress do or don't do, right? So we think about things like the government shutdown. We think about things like the president's tariffs or immigration or whatever it might be. And those are all important things, don't get me wrong. But again, the reality is that most government and most government decisions occur in states, cities, towns, counties, right? That's where the bulk of what regulates what you do as an individual is done. And so again, what that means is that opens up lots of opportunities to be able to advocate locally for things that are going to affect you where you live, which actually is way more beneficial than trying to do things like tell the president what the president should do on a particular topic. Because of course the president is representing everybody in the United States, and so that means there are a lot of people involved in this process. But if you happen to live in, say, Sugar House, and you're concerned about a new hotel going up, or the width of the street, or whether there's a stop sign on your street or something like that, right? Those are things that people can affect much more immediately and have an impact on. And again, keep in mind that those are every bit as important politically, right, as immigration and tariffs and all those kinds of things. So what I would say is that I think centralization is generally a problem, right? In that it tends to limit opportunities to participate, and decentralization actually is quite helpful in terms of allowing more participation in that process.
Is there any more questions? Okay.
So this might be a specific topic, but I guess like I'm wondering how can, for example, like undocumented immigrants in general, like how can they advocate for their communities in a way? Because like I don't know, maybe it may seem scary for those individuals to kind of expose their situation and to kind of bring the word out for what's going on in their lives. Because maybe they came from a country that is impoverished and they left to come here and they really enjoy their life here, but they're paying taxes like everybody else and they can't really benefit from the system, which can also explain why they don't want to advocate. But for those who do, how can they really advocate without, I don't know, maybe not endangering their lives in a way? Because maybe they love this country and they want to improve the community as well, even if they're not full citizens here.
It's a very good question. And what I would say would be that we have actually looked at that question of how people who are not citizens and therefore, again, can't legally vote, do they engage in politics? And the answer is yes, they do engage in politics, right? And they engage in politics in a whole variety of ways because, again, one of the advantages of the American system is because there are lots of ways to advocate and be a part. So one thing I would note about that, right, is I think your presentation of that was exactly right in the sense that if you are here as an immigrant, and particularly if you're an undocumented immigrant, your primary concern may be to avoid politics and avoid political actors and avoid police and agencies like that for fear of what may happen to you, right? And that's absolutely a fair point. But it's also worth noting, right, that there are opportunities for people in a range of situations to be able to articulate those views. One of the things that is true about the nature of immigration, right, and you sort of said this, if you're an immigrant, you're often here working, you're often here paying taxes, and those are things that are well worth noting and pointing out, right, so that it makes the point that immigrants can indeed be a positive benefit, and people who are immigrants are often able to in essence, articulate that view better than anybody else because that's their experience. Right? It's absolutely the case that you have to be cautious about that, however, because again, speaking generally about being an undocumented immigrant carries a risk with it, right? And so again, one of the things that I think has to happen in there for there to be effective advocacy on those kinds of issues is that there are others who are willing to make that case as well. So I think this is a circumstance of working with others in a group is going to be beneficial because that way it's not simply the person who is an undocumented immigrant trying to speak up for themselves, but making sure that other people understand the value of immigration and the role of immigrants within the economy and within the broader society.
Is there any more questions?
Yeah, just to continue on that topic. So, from my understanding, it's ultimately relying on people who are citizens here who could speak up for those people. But from my understanding, it's, I guess, people who are in those positions, undocumented or not, they're limited then. So, do they really have, I don't know, some sort of power unless someone recognizes it that lives here, that lives in the comfort here? They have to, someone at the outside looking has to recognize that. From my understanding, like, do they really have, I don't know, a power to, you know, help out their community? They really have to if they can. Because, for example, I'm from Chicago, Illinois, and I know a lot of people that, you know, that were advocating for immigrants in general. And just like that, they get ICE just taking them out of their homes, as simply as that, just for talking out, just groups of people. So you're talking about having groups of people unionizing and together and targeting in a way, but in some areas, it's like they don't even care. They just take them out of the country regardless of that, if they're a group. So I'm just really trying to understand, is it really just ultimately someone has to recognize the issue? That someone that lives here, like, is there really no other option?
I would say that that's probably the best option. And the reason I say that is because, again, it is true, right? The people who are undocumented immigrants are not going to have the kind of same legal recourse that citizens would have, right? So for example, right, they can't vote. And that means they can't, you know, vote in federal elections, they can't vote in state elections, et cetera. So that kind of avenue is prohibited to them. But again, that doesn't mean that people who are citizens of the United States can't vote in such a way that would benefit people who are in some of those circumstances, right? It also does not mean that people who are here legally would not be able to articulate that case. Now, I think the point that you made is an important one, right? That again, there is a serious risk if you are an undocumented immigrant, and your inclination may be very sensibly, right, to kind of keep your head down and stay out of trouble, right? That's a very kind of normal and natural reaction. The reality is, however, that there are ways of being able to advocate and advocate effectively. Again, not to say that you're always going to be able to win that, right? Again, right now we have federal administration that has a particular set of views about the nature of immigration laws. But again, keep in mind that in general, the United States has been quite open to immigration and quite welcoming of immigration. And so there are lots of people with lots of views on that topic. And again, there are ways to be able to advocate effectively even in that circumstance, right? Which admittedly is a very challenging circumstance.
Thank you.
I do have a question as well too. So as college students, it can sometimes feel like it's hard to feel respected by people in these positions of power, just a lot of times because of age. Do you have any tips or any advice on how to navigate that?
So you're asking the old guy whether he's got any tips. Okay. One of the things I would say is that it can be challenging because the reality is, being a college student, there are lots of things you have to do, right? All the kind of standard things that people have to do every day, plus classes and assignments and all those other things, right? So it's a challenge, there's no doubt about that. I would note, however, that college students also have some advantages. One of the advantages is that college students also tend to be people who are interested and curious and willing to spend some time exploring, and so that's very helpful, right? So take advantage of the natural sense of, hey, I can figure this out, right? And make use of that, I think. The other point I would note is that it's a perfectly reasonable thing in the world of politics and political advocacy to ask people for help. And where people are most inclined to want to help, for example, is if you say, I'm a college student and I'm trying to figure out how to, right? That often is something that, oh, you're a college student, I can help you with that, right? Much more than if you say, you know, I've lived here for 60 years and I've always complained about this and I'm still gonna complain, right? Sometimes that doesn't necessarily get a great response from people in power. And so I would say there are ways to take advantage of the fact that you're a college student and make that work for you. The reality of the world of politics is that's one of the things you just should try to do. Right? So that, I guess, would be my answer.
Any other questions?
Awesome. Thanks a lot for coming. Just real quick before we wrap up, my name is Ethan Foley. I'm a student governance advisor, so I advise these guys for ASUU. I did have one question, because this has been a topic of conversation that I've been having with Rory and Trevin and some of our other students in the room. So to give you some context, I care very deeply about the legislative and shared governance process, as I think a lot of our students in this room do. And in my life, I've seen, as I think a lot of folks here also have, that when you're in a state or in a locality where the dominant political perspective is very heavy to one side, to the left or right, if we're going to say that there's those two sides, for example, it can feel kind of defeating and almost pointless to advocate. And I know you talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but something I've been talking with Rory and Trevin about as we're talking with students across campus is like, and I would love to hear yours, what would your 30-second pitch to students be of like why they should advocate and why they shouldn't feel like it's hopeless? And I say this because I think, I lived in Vermont for a while. I had a roommate as an undergrad in Vermont who was conservative and felt like, well, what's the point of me even participating? In the land of Bernie Sanders. And then I think, I advise students in ASUU every day who feel like, well, what's the point in engaging in Utah when, there's a very heavy, specific, general political perspective that's dominant here. So regardless of the opinions of those students, one side or the other, I guess I'm curious, what's your 30-second pitch to them of what they can share with their peers of like, this is why you should advocate regardless of whether or not your opinion aligns with the majority?
I guess my response to that would be that the primary reason for doing so is to make sure that indeed your views, that people recognize and hear your views. And so one of the things that, so I study public opinion. One of the things that is true in public opinion is something known as the spiral of silence, right? And that's the basic idea that if you think you hold an unpopular position, you're less likely to express it. And what happens? It becomes less and less popular because nobody expresses that point of view. And so the reality is that it's important to articulate that even if it is a minority view, even if it's not the view that's going to carry the day, it's important to let people know, yeah, here's my view, here's why I hold this view, here's how this connects to other things, and again, ideally what this will do, doesn't always work, but ideally what it will do is allow people who are articulating different points of view, right, to be able to find some common ground on those views. So I think that's the primary reason for bothering to participate, is that it is something that, again, even if you're not going to win this particular vote or the bill passes and you really didn't like it, right, it's well worth articulating your views about that, because one of the things that comes out of that, right, is a recognition that, oh yeah, there are these other points of view, there are other people out there who don't necessarily agree with this, and I need to think about that in the process.
Okay, well, that's a wrap on our event. Let's give one more round of applause to Professor Bergman. Yeah, feel free to stick around. There's still more food outside. Yeah.
And then just so you guys are aware too, this is the first part of a 3-part series. So Professor Burbank did a fantastic job giving us the intro to how to get involved and how the governmental structure works here in the United States. In January, we are going to have the second part of the event where we will be talking about specifically more how to get involved with the legislature, your rights as a constituent. And again, that will be hosted here in the Hinckley. And then in March, we also are partnering with the Policy Project, which is just a local advocacy group who has done a lot of work with the legislative, that has done a lot of work with the legislation here in Utah. And they are coming in to talk about kind of how to take an initiative and kind of the process it takes to get it into law. And so we would love for you guys to come to those events. So we have little flyers over there that you can grab on your way out that have the upcoming dates. You can mark it on your calendars. And then also there is a sign up on the computer as well too, that if you want any like reminder emails or text messages leading up to it as well too, you can leave that information there and we will send you more information and reminders as it gets closer. But thank you all for coming out and grab food on your way out.